Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Friday. Thank you for joining today's office hours session, the legislative halftime report. You can go to the next slide, Nick. So for today's agenda, they'll be covering a number of topics, and I'll introduce our speakers here in a moment. Going to kick things off with the legislative landscape and context for this 2026 session, discuss some of the coalition's priorities, go through the report card, as we're calling it, which is going to capture some of the key progress and setbacks, a specific update on HB 1733, which a lot of us are paying attention to, and then finally, discussion about some opportunities for member engagements and next steps. And for today's speakers, we have Dina Dennis, who is our Director of Regulatory and Legislative Affairs, Andrew Provencher, our Principal for Main Street Strategic, and Clifton Belo, who is the Chair of the RLAC Committee. So I know you're familiar with all of these people, but I always like to introduce who's going to be talking today. Before I turn it over to Dina to carry things on, just a reminder, feel free to use the chat function for questions as they come up, or maybe raise your hand during the session and we can call on you towards the end. There should be plenty of time for questions and discussion. And these sessions are recorded and posted to our YouTube. So I like to mention that when I remember. So with that, I will officially turn it over to Dina Dennis. Take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jackson. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for making time to join us today. And also as a reminder, in addition to the chat feature and raise hand feature, we will have a dedicated time for Q&A at the end of the formal presentation. So definitely hold on to your questions for that. So I thought to tee us up a little bit, to know where we're going, it's helpful to understand where we came from. And I invited Andrew Provencher, who's principal with Main Street Strategic, to join us. Andrew is consultant to CPCNH, and he supports our work in a couple of capacities on the communications side, as well as the government affairs and lobbying side. So I want to invite Andrew on to help set the stage for today's presentation and discussion, and just kind of recap the landscape and some of the political context that we walked into in this year's session, where it's going now and where it might be headed through the end of the session. So welcome, Andrew, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to everyone today. It's always great doing these halftime reports. As you know, the New Hampshire legislature, moves pretty quickly in the time that it is there. But thankfully, as we get to crossover right now, where kind of all the House bills are going to the Senate and Senate bills go to the House, you have an opportunity to kind of take a look of everything and how it's gone through the process. In New Hampshire this year, starting the legislative session, it's the second part of the biennium. So the first part is focused on really the budget process. The second part tends to be a little more policy involved, at least in items that aren't costing money. So non-financial pieces for the most part. Some of the early bills that we saw put through definitely focused some policy goals on kind of like moving the state away from some of its renewable energy policy. Some work that would kind of change renewable portfolio standards. There was some bills that had to do with eliminating the local solar tax exemption. So kind of a number of bills that I would say target renewables and RPS. The legislature right now has a Republican majority in the House and the Senate and a Republican governor. We're going to get to the governor in a second on a couple energy pieces, but for the most part, the Senate has been, slightly more aligned in some ways with defending some of the existing renewable energy positions. We've been pretty active on a number of bills, along with coalition partners on some legislation that targets some of these areas, and also moving forward with some of our own priorities for the year. In regards to the governor, during the state of state, she had spoken specifically about like runaway costs and rates and the cost of electricity. It's been something that their office has talked about a lot, specifically about the expense of electricity rates. We had a new PUC commissioner appointed, Chris Elms. He comes from the Department of Energy. He's now the chair of the PUC. During his hearings in the Executive Council, he spoke about a focus being that of helping to reduce rates in some manner or capacity. And then, DOE has kind of elevated some folks from within to fill some of those other positions. Josh Elliott being moved up the chain, and I think DOE for the most part has played a very similar sheet of music as they have in the last session and in the years prior on some of their posturing for some of the bills of our interest. So not only did the governor talk about the rates during the State of the State, but she's had a couple statements having to do with energy supply, in particular that of nuclear energy, or finding ways to increase that, finding ways to increase building and supply of that. She also recently had a couple statements relative to the Day Ahead Ancillary Services Initiative, or DAISY, and asking them to move away from this process. Something that I think that we certainly can agree with. So along with the kind of the talk of smaller nuclear, the talk of this nuclear commission to determine how we would bring nuclear energy on, the governor is kind of, I think, slowly tiptoeing into the energy space more so than she was in the first part of the session when it was obviously more budget focused. The only other piece that I would want to add is we have seen a number of pieces of legislation that start to revert back to the allowing of utility companies to own or build generation, which has been something that we've been following and engaged in this process. In most scenarios, that is focused on nuclear energy, but not always the case. And it's certainly something that I think that for whatever reason, there seems to be some sort of appetite in the legislature to, among some, to revert back to utility ownership of generation. So obviously that's a pretty big deal and something we've got our eyes on, and something that I think will likely be an issue that isn't going away anytime soon.
Yeah, I started for you.
You did.
Just a little bit.
Really?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew. That's some really helpful remarks. I've got a couple of questions for you, but I'd like to maybe reserve them to the end during the Q&A session. So I think we can go on to the next slide. And this is really just a reminder for how CPCNH determines its legislative priorities. Every biennium, so every 2 years, the CPCNH Regulatory and Legislative Affairs Committee, or RLAC, puts together the legislative platform that then goes to the board for review and approval. And the legislative platform really is the driver of our legislative and policy agenda for the biennium. There may have been instances like there was when we first started doing this, which was in the middle of a biennium, where we updated it more frequently. But I think our goal right now is to just update it every other year in advance of the new legislative biennium. So with that, the legislative platform really drives our agenda, what kind of bills that we would support, oppose, engage in, or monitor. And so I just wanted to review with you what each of those categories means and how that determines, what our position is, and then what level of prioritization and what the kind of advocacy that we would be engaged in. And then, of course, as a reminder, all of this information, plus all 57 bills that we're monitoring or engaged with this session, can be found on our bill tracker on the advocacy website. And maybe Nick or Jackson can drop a link into the chat so folks are reminded of that in terms of individual bills that we're engaged on, and what their individual, where they stand in the process. You can also subscribe to updates on those bills as well. So in terms of the bills that we support, again, this would be legislation that aligns with the legislative platform and our strategic policy goals. And in terms of how we engage, these are bills that we're actively supporting and advocating for this session. So we're, building coalitions, we're meeting and advocating directly with legislators. We're testifying, we're encouraging member outreach and engagement and testimony. So we're kind of doing all of the above. And then bills that we oppose, these are bills that would obviously are not aligned with the legislative platform and bills that would undermine New Hampshire's community power framework, bills that would harm competitive markets in the state, customer choice, and or negatively impact local energy control and innovation. And those are generally bills that we're, again, actively opposing and advocating against this session. And then this year, RLAC actually decided to create a third category, which is engage. And those are essentially bills that we're engaging constructively. We might have some possible concerns around some of the provisions, and we might also be supportive of other provisions, but essentially we're not taking a specific position at the time, but we will engage by testifying at bill hearings, educating legislators, proposing amendments, engaging and educating other stakeholders and coalition partners. And then not included here, but bills that we're just monitoring. So those are kind of the other catch-all bills that there might be some interest, but it's minimal, but it does have some overall input to New Hampshire energy policy and the energy market. So they're bills that we're monitoring. And then, RLAC, through our charter, we have a whole chain of command in terms of how decisions are made on individual bills. RLAC makes recommendations at the beginning of each session to the board, and then the board approves those positions or would tell RLAC to go back and reconsider its recommendation. In the event that RLAC is not able to meet before, let's say there's a bill hearing that came up and we didn't know about the legislation, or it was recently introduced and it does have some, impact that's significant and of immediate concern, we have channels that, the executive committee or the board could step in and approve that. And then, as a backup, the executive director or CEO could do that in consultation with the RLAC and board chair. And then kind of final event, I would have the authority to do that in consultation with the RLAC chair. So we have that process lined up. And, there are instances where there are bills that we might have opposed or supported. And because they were maybe amended to be better or less bad, we might want to change our position to engage or something else. That has been the case with one bill from last session, House Bill 610. It relates to the Office of the Consumer Advocate. We had opposed it last year, but over the course of the fall, there were some helpful amendments made where we changed the position to, I believe, engage or support. So that can happen all the time, and we definitely welcome input from our members and stakeholders, as well as policymakers. If they think there's something that's not on our radar that we should be engaged on, please reach out and let us know. So with that, we can go to the next slide. And I just wanted to kind of go through, where things stand, overall in a somewhat challenging political environment and legislative session. I think we're making some significant progress. There's certainly some areas of concern that Andrew had mentioned, specifically around, this reversion to utility monopoly models for, power generation and distributed energy. But I want to start with the good first. So we'll go to the left side on the green. So one bill that, again, I mentioned from last year, it's headed to the governor. We are supportive of the language that came out in the Senate. This is a bill that originally was going to get rid of the Office of the Consumer Advocate as it stands as an independent entity and kind of fold it into the Department of Energy. We had worked really closely with the Consumer Advocate and other stakeholders to, either get this bill ITL'd or amend it to make it better. the consumer advocate has been the lead on that and was able to get some language inserted in the Senate that address some of the concerns that he had, as well as us and other entities. And so we're really pleased to see that going to the governor's office. The OCA will stay its independent office, and the consumer advocate, the requirements will still be that it's a lawyer. Then we'll go over to some of the other bills that have crossed over from their chamber of origin and have passed through the first committee and or the floor in the opposite chamber. So we'll start with House Bill 1718. That's a bill that we had worked with Representative Michael Bowes on the House side, as well as utilities and other stakeholders, and some of the Democrats on the committee. This bill authorizes energy storage in connection with net metering. In the House, we were able to work with the bill sponsors and stakeholders to negotiate some favorable amendment language around how the storage device could be charged, that reflect the how things, the current market and state of things, and also address needs of the consumer. So we're pleased that that language got in. It came out with a unanimous recommendation from the House Science, Tech, and Energy Committee. It went to Finance. There was no concerns. It got a unanimous recommendation of OTPA, and then it crossed over. It passed in the House earlier in March, and then crossed over to the Senate. The Senate did hear it. I want to say it was last week, and they did exec it last Thursday. They included a minor technical amendment that the DOE uncovered related to a piece of law that was not directly addressed, but referenced, just to update something that is now a DOE responsibility and not a PUC. So we're neutral on that. It's fine. So that should be going to the Senate floor, I believe, next week. And then Senate Bill 590, that is a bill that we had requested with the town of Peterborough and Bruce Tucker as the lead on that. And that bill authorizes municipalities to use a revolving fund to support energy services as part of their electric aggregation plans. So this is just allowing a familiar financing tool for municipalities to make it easier to do some of the things, whether it's a energy project or program that they want to offer for their community. It gives them another financing tool to do that. So that actually was heard in the Senate, I believe last Tuesday. And then it was also, in the House last Tuesday, and it was the Tuesday, what week are we in? Yes, last Tuesday. It was exec in the committee earlier this week on Monday. So that will be going over to the House floor. And the fiscal note was removed. So that is great because it means it doesn't have to go to the Finance Committee. So it should be on the floor for next Thursday. So great. So next we have House Bill 1733, which is a bill that was introduced by Representative Mike Harrington on the House ST&E Committee. This bill seeks to reform utility default service. If you recall, CPCNH had advocated for a bill last year, House Bill 760, that would make some changes and specifically prohibit cost shifting through non-bypassable charges of utility supply costs. That bill it was ITL'd in committee, and then it was tabled in the House, which meant it could come back in this year's session. And we weren't sure, given the political climate, that there was going to be interest, but our bill sponsor, Representative Tom Corman, reintroduced it. And then another supplier had worked with Representative Harrington to get that bill introduced. And that bill had some slight differences, but CPCNH supported that one, as well as the other bill introduced by Representative Corman. When it got to the House or heard in the committee earlier this year in February, there was actually much stronger support for the concept. And the committee ultimately, on a unanimous bipartisan basis, incorporated an amendment that also addressed the procurement issue and included language that would prohibit spot market procurements for residential and small and medium-sized customers, except in the instance where a utility fails to get bids, through a fixed price contract service. So we really like that language. It was even stronger than what either bill had been introduced as. It went on to the House on the consent calendar and was passed unanimously with a voice vote. And then, however, it hit some snags in the Senate. And so for that, I want to pause because we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive on the next slide on that. So real quickly, Senate Bill 538, that deals with municipal host net metering projects. And as introduced, it would give a 20-year period rather than sunsetting in 2040. It was heard in the House last week, and on Monday they execed it, and they incorporated a change that reduces the 20-year term to a 15-year term. So I think it's likely going to pass the House in that form. Other stakeholders are a bit neutral, hoping to see this go to committee of conference and potentially be worked out, with more favorable term language. House Bill 1742, that is an important customer protection bill. It addresses something that CPCNH has encountered in many instances, which is inadvertent enrollment of net metering customers when community power launches. So this bill provides, recognition that, utility systems can be fallible and not catch these net metered customers before we opt out enrollment of community power, and it provides recourse and remedy for that. I think it's the utility will make the customer whole up to 4 months and will, I think, within 21 days, restore them back to utility default service. So while this would not apply retroactively, it would be prospective, and it, is a good consumer protection policy in those instances. And then House Bill 1535, that is the famous semicolon bill introduced by Representative Tom Corman and Senator Sue Prentice at the request of Clifton Belo. And that bill is important because it fixes that punctuation error and allows landfill gas to requalify as a New Hampshire Class 1 resource, a renewable energy resource. So like in the instance of Lebanon, right now, I think they have to sell to Rhode Island, is it, Cliff? And that's a missed opportunity for the state to take advantage of those locally produced RECs and potentially even the coalition to be able to purchase those RECs to satisfy our requirements.
Yeah, it's generating Rhode Island RECs, even though it's located here in New Hampshire. So,
yep, great. So that bill has it moved through the House very quickly. I think the Senate, it came out of the committee last week, and it might have actually been on the consent calendar yesterday. If it wasn't yesterday, it's probably going on next week. So that's good. And then just moving over to the middle of the slide, a couple of bills that we opposed died on the table. So that's good things. House Bill 1002, that's the bill that would get rid of the local tax exemption for solar systems. And then House Bill 1721, which made some changes to the RPS eligibility. And that bill got tabled. And then when crossover happened, it essentially died. So that's good. Moving over, there were a couple of bills that were ITL, inexpedient to legislate in their first committees. Senate Bill 537 and House Bill 1736, they do the same thing. They would prohibit the Public Utilities Commission ability to consider alternative forms of regulation when it comes to utility rate making. And these were bills that CPCNH we did not oppose outright, but we had some concerns and wanted to use them as educational opportunities. So these were bills we engaged in. They were ITL'd, which is good. We think that the commission should have these tools, and there could be, benefits, if the alternative regulation scheme is done right, that it could have benefits for the state and the competitive market. And then there's 3 bills that have crossed over from the Chamber of Origin, but have not yet been acted on by committee. And that might have, this may be like a day out of, I may be like a day out of touch because there was some action yesterday and I was at a hearing, so I did not get a chance to sit in for the Senate committee's exec session. But Senate Bill 591 and House Bill 1775, they do similar things. Although originally as drafted, they would have allowed utilities back in the ownership of power generation of large size, and specifically looking at nuclear and natural gas. And this is kind of the whole concern of we're in a supply crisis and we need to produce more power within New Hampshire, and that's going to lower energy costs and therefore energy rates for New Hampshire customers. At least that's kind of the impetus, the idea behind that. Both bills were amended to maybe make it less bad. The concern there is that allowing monopoly utilities back into the power generation business, is really, it's a bad thing. It's risky for consumers. It undermines competition, distorts competition. If utilities are able to own and then rate base these type of generators, and what impetus would customers have for shopping on the competitive market, or even having community power if they're going to have to pay for them through their utility bills. So those bills were amended to be more focused on the distributed energy side. So like up to 5 megawatts per installation. So we're talking about the load reducer size. We're still not happy with them because it still perpetuates a monopoly market, because right now competitive entities like CPCNH don't have a means of accessing the same price signals and avoided cost values that the monopoly utilities do to be able to offer these projects. And the way they're dealt with from rate making, utilities are allowed to recover the costs through distribution rates, and as opposed to from their default supply customers. So the costs and benefits are essentially socialized. And the way the law is written, if a utility is able to prove out the cost benefit on day 1, but then somewhere along the line, let's say year 5, the costs start to exceed the benefits. Well, if the PUC has already approved the cost into rates, ratepayers are still on the hook for that investment for 20 potentially more years. So we have a lot of concerns with that. It again goes back to this New Hampshire Energy Forward, leveling the playing field and enabling market opportunities for competitive entities like CPCNH and others. And then House Bill 1542, that, again, this is like going at an attempt like last year of refunding the Renewable Energy Fund to ratepayers. This bill has been amended. There's a bill from last session that has come back. And essentially, I think it would rob the last $1 million that's in the REF and would refund that back to ratepayers. And again, that's sort of like coming from the majority's mindset that this is a cost that should be returned to ratepayers, and looking for any possible means to lower costs and address affordability. And then the last bill that is also from last year is House Bill 723. This bill would essentially cancel out the data platform. And this is an initiative that CPCNH has been working on for quite some time, and CPCNH leaders have been working on since 2019 when the enabling legislation was passed. Building out this platform across the state with all utilities participating would just open up the door a lot for being able to get customer data, being able to market and offer programs that would help lower costs and meet consumer needs and interests. So it's unfortunately a really missed opportunity for the state. The opposition largely driven from the Department of Energy, who I think is very cautious about the upfront costs and then the uncertainty of what the short and long-term benefits might be. So we have, I think, exhausted efforts to thwart the governor from signing this into law, but unless Andrew has other updates, it seems like she'll likely sign it or not sign it, and it will go into law.
I
So,
think that's correct.
sorry, Andrew, say that again.
Yeah, I don't have I believe that is correct at this point. I don't foresee a veto, but we have certainly asked.
Okay. All right. So that was a lot. Maybe I'll take a pause if there's any burning or clarification questions. I don't see anything. I don't see any hands raised. I don't know if there's anything in the chat.
Yeah, not at this time, Dina. We'll keep
And
an eye
this
on
is
that.
not meant to be exhaustive. Obviously, going through 57 bills would probably take more than 2 hours. So these are sort of the top priority bills that are still in play. All right, so let's go to the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit more about House Bill 1733. So just as mentioned, it was strengthened and came out of the House unanimously. It hit some snags as it made its way over to the Senate. And what happened was at the Senate hearing in late March, the bill sponsors actually came to the hearing basically saying that the bill may not be needed and that maybe interim study would be more appropriate. And they cited outreach from the PUC, at least 2 PUC commissioners, and then folks from the Department of Energy, that this bill is essentially premature, and that the spot market procurement scheme may be causing greater savings than costs. And I think that outreach from the PUC and the department, caused some greater concern about this. So it came into the Senate on very unsteady ground. We were tipped off actually by the bill sponsor the week prior, so we were able to kind of triage a little bit before the hearing. At the hearing, the Department of Energy, who had been neutral on the bill when it was in the House, came out strongly opposed to it. While the PUC did not testify, it was mentioned by the bill sponsor, or Representative Bose, that the PUC also opposed it. And so what happened was a lot of, behind the scenes talks and negotiations and horse trading. It was amended in the committee last Thursday. And they took a proposal that was offered at the hearing from Eversource, which sort of watered down a little bit the language around the procurement. It still had that general prohibition of using spot markets to satisfy the load of residential and small and medium commercial customers, but it included kind of more of an off-ramp if needed, if the bids weren't found to be reasonable. And then it also watered down the language around prohibiting cost shifting. And it included some language that includes extraordinary circumstances. So the language that was approved would allow exceptions only if the PUC were to determine an extraordinary circumstance, and only through a formal adjudicatory proceeding, where parties would have, full due process rights. So I would say where we landed in the Senate, it's not to our satisfaction, and we're certainly working to improve it. And we think, continuing to, make this issue, highlight this issue and the risks of, how the utilities have been directed to procure. And the commission has been, deferring some of the reconciliations, particularly with Liberty, which is over $8 million. And, Liberty's situation is also a little bit nuanced, and we could talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A as well. So that's kind of where things stand. Our ask right now is for the House to not concur and request a committee of conference. We don't know that Representative Bose and House leadership is there yet. We've made the ask. We know that other suppliers, other coalition partners have been making the ask. The goal is to, get them to agree and make that action. And then, we'd have a chance to sit at the table with them and with other stakeholders, including the DOE, to try and work out some language that is more satisfactory to us and to others. So maybe I'll stop there, offer Cliff or Henry, I don't know if he's on, a chance to add some further comment, Andrew as well.
Just observe that it's just kind of now that the chickens are coming home to roost, so to speak, in Liberty's case, the anticipation by the commission that their proxy price methodology would reasonably estimate the cost and there wouldn't be a problem with reconciling over and under collections is not proving out. Liberty's had last year, not the current year, but through July of 2025, it turns out, they'd run up quite a considerable under collection, especially compared to their relatively small default service load. About 4 million of that is directly attributable to under collections relative to the proxy price. And subsequently, not through the Community Power Coalition, but through Freedom Energy Logistics, the town of Salem departed utility default service. They got a all requirements contract that at least for the first 6 months was or so, or 12 months, I forget exact term, but was lower than the Liberty cost. And so that removed over half of their remaining default service customer base. And now Windham and Pelham, which are two of the last significant sized towns where Liberty has load, are departing. And because the commission and to some extent, the DOE have caused the can to be kicked down the road, as Liberty originally proposed to start recovering these costs last August, but the commission only let them recover half of it. And then the expectation is they adjust in December to start recovering the balance, and that didn't happen either. And so now we're sort of down to the wire. We had I testified at a hearing yesterday that about the need to go ahead and raise their rate so that they get whatever contribution they can from Windham and Salem customers before they depart, because they are the ones who have benefited from what was a below cost price. And so, we've sort of been trying to say this, but it's hard for people to believe that the commission would have approved rates that don't cover the cost of utility default service, but that is what has happened. And not only did they approve them, they're the ones who directed the utilities to begin this speculative experiment of buying in the spot market while using a proxy price methodology to try to estimate the cost that the commission itself came up with. So they can't blame the utility for making bad decisions. And now we're in the ridiculous situation where there may be so much under collection, because we haven't even seen the total from this past winter and such, with Liberty, that it would be very large rate increase to recover it from the remaining default service customers. And so that is sort of why, as this was sort of dawning on the DOE and the commission, that they kind of got worried about this bill that might say you can only collect it from the default service customers for default service. And instead, it appears as though they want to keep open the option of charging our customers who've stayed with us for the past year and a half when our rates have been higher than Liberty's and the other utilities, and ask our customers to help bail out the PUC's creation of new stranded costs, deferred stranded costs, and in effect subsidize the customers who stayed on default service and got a price for power that was below their cost of service. So that's sort of a little context for what's going on with this issue. The good thing is the consumer advocate was, supportive of what, our recommendation and testimony to go ahead and adjust the rate. And the problem is rates have to be just and reasonable, and they're creating a situation where there's no good, just, and reasonable solution, because to try to go back and collect from Salem and Wyndham customers after they've left default service would potentially violate the state constitution in terms of retroactive rate making. So it's a bit of a mess, and our challenge and opportunity is to help really explain this and make it clear that part of the problem was the commission deciding to speculate, to force the utilities to speculate in the spot market, which quite honestly was what got us into trouble when we speculated a year ago last November, December, about the cost in that early winter period. And we were exposed to the spot market and lost millions of dollars, just like Liberty has done as well. And we raised our rates to cover our cost because we don't have the option of borrowing off the regulated utility balance sheet. In Liberty's case, they forked over $8.5 million, or I'm sorry, $8.3 million to cover this, and they're just carrying this with what should be distribution utility working capital tied up in under recoveries in their default service rate, which they don't make a profit on. So they just want to be able to pass through the cost. And Liberty, for instance, never was enthusiastic about this speculative spot market strategy. And they were also the one utility that came out early on, like a year ago, and said we got to start doing reconciliations more frequently, so we don't end up down in a hole that we can't get ourselves out of. And my point yesterday is they're in a hole, and they need to stop digging, which is what's going to happen if they just keep the rates at below cost. And they need to start correcting that now. So we'll see what the commission does. The consumer advocate ended up endorsing our recommendation that they go ahead and adjust rates upward now, even though it's not on the normal 6-month cycle. But it's clear that they're under collecting, and they need to start recovering these deferred costs instead of letting them grow and creating their own crisis that they look to our customers to bail them out for their bad decisions. And I'm not talking about Liberty's bad decisions because they've been trying to do the right thing. I'm talking about the PUC bad decisions. And DOE kind of played along with it and was instrumental in kicking this can down the road. And they said they don't support raising the rate because they want more time to think about it. And that's sort of their repeated story of why this couldn't be resolved last fall when Liberty put in testimony last September explaining that this entire $8 million balance is something that was legitimate and that should recover. Just one last bit of context. What happened was last June, the commission said, oh, this seems like an awful lot of under recovery. Something must be wrong here because we'd shown something was wrong with Unitil and Eversource. But there wasn't, the same issues weren't the case in Liberty's. And the commission themselves said, oh, well, only start trying to recover half of that and assume Salem doesn't leave. Well, Salem left, and nowhere close to recovering half of it because they've had new under collections this past winter, and they're still in the hole. And And
the
they've
whole
kind of convinced the House members to back off of a principled position and say, well, as a practical matter, we kind of we've created a death spiral, and we need options to bail us out of this problematic situation we've created. That
um,
that's enough for me.
Thank you, Cliff. I think it's helpful context to share, what this means in practice. And, the Liberty situation, if it was a postcard from the future last year, we're about to, see what being 50% exposed to the spot market in the wintertime is like for the other two utilities that are serving much higher volumes of load. So the magnitude of the undercollection could be a lot greater than what we've seen with Liberty, which was for last year. So with that, maybe we can go to the next slide and then we'll open it up for questions. And as part of our continued advocacy on this issue, we are asking members to take action. One of the best ways you can do this is by, of course, talking to your elected officials and by making your voice known through your local press and media outlets. So we're encouraging members to submit letters to the editors, write op-eds, submit them to your local press. We're happy to help support you in that. If you'd like us to, definitely reach out to Jackson or Nick or myself. And then just want to highlight some coverage of this issue recently. Henry had an op-ed earlier this month run in the New Hampshire Journal. Of course, consumer advocate Don Kreese has been posting about this a lot in his blog. So he's had a couple of articles recently there. And as Andrew mentioned, the governor has been more keyed into these issues and has definitely latched on to the new Day-Ahead Ancillary Service Initiative, or the DAISY market, and the cost impacts to the region, and as well as New Hampshire. And then just yesterday, a letter to the editor ran in the Seacoast Online by Bill Baber. So anything else you want to include, Nick or Jackson, Andrew, about this?
I think you covered that well, Dina. Yeah, we just appreciate all of our members doing what they can to raise awareness, as Cliff pointed out, of this important issue. And so please get in touch. We're happy to share resources with you and help in that effort. But we're happy to see that we're getting some coverage of this, and we look forward to continuing to work in member services to raise awareness with the media, and we know of a couple upcoming opportunities for that, which is great, and appreciate the collaboration with Dina, Andrew Provencher, Nick, and Henry, and others on this effort.
Thanks. If we could go to 2 slides next, before we jump into Q&A. I just want to flag upcoming policy programming that the coalition has. We'll be doing our annual legislative wrap-up on June 18th. I know that's a Thursday. CPCNH, the office is closed on June 19th for the Juneteenth holiday, so we're hosting it a day early. And that will be during the regularly scheduled office hours time slot of 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern local. Yeah, so I guess with that, we can take the slides down and answer any questions that people have. While people are gathering their thoughts, I want to just touch base with Andrew, a couple of things that I had been thinking of when he spoke. With House Bill 1733 coming out of the Senate on the consent calendar yesterday, what is your sense, Andrew, on timing for when the House would be faced with action to concur or not concur, request committees of conference?
Yeah, that Senate message should probably be sent over as early as next week, but potentially the week after. So I think that the time frame in which they could request a committee of conference could happen as early as next week. But like I said, there's quite a few Senate messages that are coming over, and they can kind of pull them out as they wish, depending on when they're falling on the calendar for them. So I think that it's as early as next week, as late as a couple weeks after that.
And we know the deadline for the House to request committees of conference is May 21st.
Correct.
Great, thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Any other questions, comments? Good of the order.
Not seeing any at the moment, Dina. I'll just point out that I did put some links in the chat to a number of different resources, including Henry's op-ed and Bill's LTE. That is possibly behind a paywall for folks, so we're happy to send. We can get you that information if you need it. So please feel free to reach out about that.
And I don't know if we have handy, Jackson or Nick, the links to the House Bill 1733 bill briefing memo, and then some of our template outreach and testimony, and like our testimony, if that's helpful for folks if they're wanting to submit their own LTEs or draft op-eds. Those are definitely resources, and all of that can be found on our public advocacy page. I think if you scroll down to the bottom, you should be able to find our 2026 legislative advocacy. And then I think within that directory, there's a folder that's titled something like member advocacy resources. So from there, you can find all of those resources by bill number.
I can drop in the direct link to the 1733 folder.
Thanks, Nick.
Carol, I did see your note there, so I'll make sure to get that to you.
Great. And while Nick is doing that, we will be sending out a legislative update probably on Monday that captures some of what we discussed today, and just kind of highlights the updates on some of our key priority bills. So keep an eye out for that. Any other announcements or things you want to make folks aware of, Jackson?
Nothing that's top of mind for me, but really do appreciate everyone's continued participation in these sessions. And we'll let you know that next Friday we will have office hours dedicated to discussing CPCNH's finances. And Kathleen's working with us on a presentation that's kind of like Community Power Finance 101 in ways that could be very helpful for our member reps and board members. So that's on the horizon, and we look forward to staying engaged.
And of course, we have our annual meeting coming up on April 30th at the Grapponi Conference Center in Concord. Hopefully you've received information about that from Bobby Joe Michael. That has all the information you need and registration link. We do ask that you please register in advance, so we have a good head count for lunch. And if you are interested in serving on committees, I believe you can do so. Or if you're interested in serving on the board, as the elections will be happening that morning. Yeah, all of that information can be found in the email from Bobby Joe. Awesome. All right. Well, let's close out early on a somewhat sunny Friday afternoon. Thank you all so much. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Take care.